Going to turn to our next presenter, Rabbi Gerry Skolnik. I'll just say, first of all, to all who are joining us, a huge welcome. It's wonderful to have hundreds of folks in any given time from around the country and around the globe to be with us this evening, celebrating Shavuot and anticipating the Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. So it's just wonderful to be together, and it is in a way, a blessing of both this technology and some of the things that we're leaning into during this period to be able to feel one another's presence, even if it's in a virtual way. And I'm also just thrilled to be introduced to be able to introduce one of my teachers and mentors to present to us this evening and to be with us. Rabbi Gerald Skolnik is the spiritual leader of the Forest Hills Jewish Center. He was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary and has served as rabbi of the Forest Hills Jewish Center ever since his ordination. And I'll just say that I know that we just celebrated his 40th anniversary with the Forest Hills Jewish Center. It was a beautiful celebration. In addition to his there, Rabbi Skolnik is an important leader in our movement. He's a past president of the Rabbinical Assembly and is very active both in his home community and throughout the world in helping to strengthen Masorti Judaism and Jewish life. So, Rabbi Skolnik, we're so pleased that you're with us this evening, and you're going to be speaking about knowing the unknowable, an appreciation of Heschel's understanding of Revelation. Welcome to you, and thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you, Rabbi Blumenthal. I'm just delighted to be able to participate in this movement-wide Tikkun. I congratulate our Rabbinical Assembly on assembling this program, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it. I want to add at the outset that I had originally envisioned that it was possible that my wife, Robin, would actually be participating in this half hour with me. But the more we spoke about it, the more we realized that what I really want to talk about is my journey, my spiritual journey to coming where I am. So Robin's alive and well, and she's just fine, but she's leaving me to do this part of it, and I think she's probably on target by doing that. So talk about an arrogant title for a presentation, Knowing the Unknowable. I think maybe the topic would be appreciating how impossible it is to know the unknowable, which is really what I'd like to address. But I want to take you on a little bit of my own spiritual journey and how I've come to this topic. And those of you who are a part of my own synagogue family who are watching will know that I've spent pretty much the better part of the last 40 years trying to advance this notion of the limits of what we can know and what we can understand. So in order to really appreciate where I'm coming from, I have to take you back a little bit in my own maturation process as a Jew. I grew up in, I guess by today's standard, you would call a modern Orthodox home, although the modern Orthodoxy that I grew up in, I'm not really sure it still exists, but it very much existed when I was a kid. I went to yeshiva, elementary school, yeshiva high school. I studied at Yeshiva University, and it wasn't really until I attended Camp Ramah when I was entering my junior year of college that I was even exposed in any kind of a serious way, not only to the reality of conservative Judaism, but to the ideas that lay behind it. And my reasons for attending Ramah, which are a really great story in and of themselves, I don't have time to go into this evening, but it was the first time that I was introduced to the notion of ambivalence and doubt and the legitimacy of doubt as part of the dynamic of faith. And I've referenced many times an experience that I had early on in my experience at Ramah, where Professor Saul Wax led a prayer group of just men. That should tell you where we were at in 1971 when this took place, where he asked if any of the men who were in attendance had ever missed a day of putting on tefillin. So I had never in all of my life been asked a question like that for a variety of reasons. First of all, it was a given that I wouldn't have. And second of all, it was equally a given that had I would never have admitted it, because it would have been the death knell for me in my community. So all of a sudden, I was, this kid from an Orthodox background, being exposed, if you will, to a community of people who were fascinating to me on some cognitive level. Here were people who were really into Shabbat. They were into study of Jewish text, but they were coming at it from a very different angle that I was. And that's step one. Step two was that when I was growing up in that yeshiva world, where I learned a lot, by the way, I don't discount the experience. I knew a heck of a lot of text by the time I came to rabbinical school. But in my world where I was growing up, I was the poster child for the success of a certain kind of Jewish education that completely blurred the line between the oral Torah and the written Torah. I had no idea that there was a discipline called midrash that one could study. Who knew? In my world, Abraham broke the idols in his father's store. Moshe pushed aside, the gold and seized the coal on Pharaoh's lap. And this was all. You could have convinced me that one was in Bereshit, the other was in Shemot. That was my world, the complete blurring of lines between written Torah and oral Torah. I had no idea. And there I was. I came into Camp Ramah from this really rather parochial, if benign, at least it was for me at that point, Jewish education, pretty secure in my world, thinking that I knew where I was coming from and what I was about religiously. And then I was exposed at camp that summer to one or two pages of a book by Heschel that would explode my religious world. And I wonder how many of us on this Tikkun can point to an experience, a study experience in their lives where you read something or someone taught you something that was so out of the bounds of what you were used to that it just, it shook the ground on which you stood, and it challenged you to reevaluate completely your understanding, not only of your religious life, but of life in general. So the reason why I'm saying this is because the chapter and the pages that I was reading were from God in Search of Man, and they were in Heschel's chapter on Revelation. And I'm going to read you a portion of it so that you can appreciate of which I speak. And I just urge your indulgence as I read. It's not that much. The nature of revelation, being an event in the realm of the ineffable, is something which words cannot spell, which human language will never be able to portray. Our categories are not applicable to that which is both within and beyond the realm of matter and mind. In speaking about revelation, the more descriptive the terms, the less adequate is the description. The words in which the prophets attempted to relate their experiences were not photographs, but illustrations, not descriptions, but songs. A psychological reconstruction of the prophetic act is therefore no more possible than the attempt to paint a photographic likeness of a face on the basis of a song. The word revelation, in quotes, is like an exclamation. It is an indicative rather than a descriptive term. Like all terms that express the ultimate, it points to its meaning rather than fully rendering it. And here's the paragraph that really kind of detonated in my brain. We must not try to read chapters in the Bible dealing with the event at Sinai as if they were texts in systematic theology. Its intention is to celebrate the mystery, to introduce us to it, rather than to penetrate it or to explain it. As a report about revelation, the Bible itself is a midrash. As my teacher, Professor Frankus, would have said, full stop. Okay, I stop right there, and I need to talk about that sentence and those paragraphs for a minute. I had no idea when I was first exposed to that what to make of it. None at all. Remember, I was coming from a world where the distinction between Torah shebichtav and Torah sheba'al peh, the written Torah and the oral Torah, it wasn't a subject of discussion because there was one Torah. It had two different components to it, but it was one Torah. And the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Midrash and everything that was said after the 5 books of Moses, it was all revelation from Sinai. And we know this because we know it, because that's what we're taught. And that's what I was taught. And I was not only taught it, it was kind of drummed into my head from an early age. And I was a pretty good student and I learned a lot. And there I was, bringing all this background with me to this new idea of how to look at the world. And what could it possibly mean that as a report on revelation, the Torah itself is a midrash? So the obvious meaning, which Heschel is alluding to, is that you can take chapters 19 and 20 of the book of Exodus, which are all about what we call Ma'amad Har Sinai, the episode of the revelation at Mount Sinai. And if you are going to read that as a report on page 812 in the first section of the New York Times, where the headline would be Curious Event in Sinai Desert, and then there would be a lead thing, and then there would be a report on the thing. Hundreds of thousands of people claim to have witnessed something spectacular, but independent corroboration is hard to come by. What Heschel was saying is, take all of those ridiculous notions out of your mind and understand that chapters 19 and 20 are an effort on the part of whoever authored those texts to paint a picture for us of what it was like when God and humanity encountered each other at Sinai. It wasn't plenary revelation. It wasn't the beginning of the book of Breshit through to the end of the Tanakh. It didn't include the Mishnah and the Talmud, and it didn't include anything that we've come to regard, or I had come to regard, as being what we would benevolently call Misinai, right? It was all of Sinaitic origin. It meant that it was all rooted in a human effort to understand. So there I am, impressionable young, entering junior in college, about to go off to Israel for a year with what I thought was my surefire understanding of the way my religious world worked, forced to confront the fact that everything that I had assumed as truth, if I was going to buy into Heschel's notion, was not truth in an absolute sense, but it was truth in a poetic sense, in that it was a good faith, eloquent, elegant, magnificent, poetic effort to understand what it meant for God and humanity to encounter each other, but it wasn't the same as having everything revealed. So, earth-shattering revelation, as it were, pun intended, right? little old me had all this revealed to me at an advanced age, relatively speaking. And I realized that I needed to kind of recalibrate all of my previously cherished assumptions about faith and doubt, ambivalence, community, why it is that I do the things I do and don't do the things I don't do, because no longer could I assume that I do the things I do because God commanded me. I don't do the things I don't do because God commanded me not to. Although I guess in a metaphorical sense, you could still say that, but it wasn't the same thing as assuming that the lines of authority were so clear that Hashem was speaking to me and saying to me, do this, don't do that. And that would have been enough, to rock my world. But in a positive sense, what it did really was it really set me on, as I said, a recalibration, but a kind of newfound investigation into what revelation might really mean. And this is where the topic of what I wanted to address this evening briefly comes into play in this discussion. I've often wondered, and I had teachers at Yeshiva University, I recognize now in retrospect, who I think were trying in their own humble way to teach this. I remember one teacher in Navi, who asked the question, what does it mean to be a Navi? And I remember actually not that much of the class because I think I tuned out. I didn't understand what he was trying to convey. But I've done a lot of thinking about what does it mean to receive revelation? What was Moshe's experience? And this is where I've really started to expand that to broader interpretations for me of what it might mean. I remember as a kid that we would go on family trips and we would take our little transistor radios. Now I'm really dating myself. And if you use them at night, you might have a better chance wherever I was of picking up the home teams baseball game because the transmission was clearer at night. But the stronger the power of the receiver that you were using, the more stations you could pick up. So if you had 100 watts per channel amplifier, you could pick up, even in New York City, stations from way out in the Welterrhein. But if you're dealing with a little transistor radio, couldn't really hear that much. So I remember thinking to myself, when this whole Heschel thing started to really possess me, was maybe what Heschel was trying to say was that the prophets, Moshe among them, had a 1,000 watt per channel spiritual amplifier. And maybe they were able to discern God's message because they were, spiritually speaking, so far beyond mortal men and women that they were in a different plane of existence. And I started to expand that notion, and I still do it. I still think about it a lot in trying to understand music and poetry and art. And I think of someone like Mozart, who at the age of 4 or 5 was writing incredible compositions and dashing off, piano sonatas and concerti and operas and the Bachs and the Beethovens, who were writing this music, and Beethoven, who was deaf, right, was writing music after he lost his hearing, but he heard it in his head. And what could that possibly mean? And it kept bringing me back to this 500 or 1,000 watt per channel notion that maybe people whom we call musical geniuses are endowed by God somehow or other with the capacity to hear music in a way that we can never understand. Or what makes a Shakespeare able to compose, tragedies that and comedies that hundreds of years later we can still read for the 100th time or the 101st time and shed a tear or laugh a laugh because it's so magnificent. And I've carried with me this notion of trying to appreciate the full breadth of meaning of what Heschel might have been talking about. And I hope through the years that I'm not doing him an injustice by thinking along these lines, but I've never really recovered, in a sense, from that first encounter with a thought that was so contrary to everything that I had grown up with that it shook my world. So I started by saying at the beginning that I, have spent the better part of 40 years trying to teach the members of my own synagogue that the greatness of religious inquiry is not so much coming up with answers to the great questions, because if they were not great questions, they would have simple answers. Great questions don't have great answers. They defy answers. But the issue is learning how to ask the questions more correctly and more intelligently. And it's led me also in my career as a rabbi to really try and shy away from the model of providing people with answers to their questions, as much as leading them on a quest to ask the questions in ways that point them outwardly towards greater inquiry and greater exploration so that they might discover their own answers. It's not the same as saying, is this chicken kosher? There are objective criteria by which that can be assessed. But I was listening to my friend and my colleague, Rabbi Feinstein, before, talk about Job's questions of theodicy and why the evil seemed to prosper and why is Job being tortured like that. And, I heard him say, why is that book in the Bible? And I nodded my head when I heard him ask that question, because I've always thought that book was in the Bible because the rabbis were nodding in the direction of the fact that question has no answer. And they were giving those who are troubled by the question the option of latching on to the fact that even in our Torah, we acknowledge that the world is a far more complex thing than we would allow ourselves to think. So I owe an enormous debt, first of all, to Camp Ramah, because it was really Camp Ramah that took this, yeshiva boy, and I say that not in a ridiculing way, but in an endearment way, and taught me to see the world through more abstract lenses, to understand that what there is to learn is far greater than what we know. And I've always thought that, I was trained growing up that you get up in the morning and you say Modeh Ani, and you say Reshit Chochma Yirat Adonai, that the beginning of all wisdom is the fear of God. That's a great teaching. But I've also come to believe that the true beginning of all wisdom is understanding how little we know. And once you understand how little you really know about the great questions of life, you're starting to get smarter by the minute. So that's about where I come down. And, I hope that this is in some way illuminating for all of you who are listening and validating for all of you who are strugglers, to know that, I think that struggle is the noblest form of religious encounter. And I rarely trust people who are completely sure. They are the people that I don't want to get stuck in an elevator with. People who have no questions, because I have questions in every which way direction. But I think that if you really want to grow and you really want to challenge yourself, you have to be courageous and you have to ask the questions that are going to take you in unanticipated directions. And hopefully, that will lead you to genuine spiritual growth. So that's where I come down.
Rabbi Skolnik, thank you. First of all, it's a reminder that all of us should turn to our rabbis and ask them to tell us a little bit about their spiritual journeys. I so appreciate that the way that you've come to teach us on Shavuot, the night of revelation, is through your own personal journey of revelation, in a way, the rewriting of your own religious experience and the way that you've come to understand God in a very different way, and how that has informed you for so many years as a Jew, as a person, and as a rabbi. It's beautiful. And it's a reminder that we should tell that story to our students, and we should invite them to then tell us a little bit about their own spiritual journeys. That's just one reflection. A second is that you've reminded us that the Torah itself offers us a midrash on what we call ourselves, Yisrael, wrestling with God. That may be one of the most important, among the many stories in the Torah, that may be the most important origin story, that it's a reflection that we're supposed to wrestle, that we're not supposed to be so certain. It also is a great reminder for me. I remember sitting in one of my English literature classes as an undergraduate and putting together the idea of poetry and revelation for myself. That was my two majors were English literature and Jewish studies, and trying to find the space where those two things came together. And the idea that the way that I understood Judaism was a lived poetry, that ritual itself is poetry, that Torah is poetry, and to somehow come to terms with the idea that poetry could actually be more authoritative than what we read in a newspaper or a science textbook. And I've revisited that idea so many times in my own life when I've encountered moments that were really beyond words. Each of us probably has had those moments where, whether it's the birth of a child or sitting Shiva after the loss of a parent, or just moments where you can't even describe your own experience and feeling. And either one turns to writing one's own poetry, or one can turn to other poetry that's been written about a similar idea. And you find in that indeterminacy an expression of experience. I wonder, do you ever... Because as you said, then there are these moments where you have to decide, is this kosher or not, right? Where it's not poetry anymore. Yeah. How do you understand a Jewish life that's lived in halacha, right? That's lived with a sense of obligation, purpose, and determinacy in a space of poetry?
Oh, man. Do we have another 5 hours?
No, I'm standing on one foot.
Standing on one foot. Listen, I think that there are many ways to phrase an answer to that question, but altogether, the contemporary struggle between the commanding presence and the sovereign self, already places us in a kind of adversarial relationship with modernity, where we are conditioned to believe that we are autonomous. And Judaism demands that we're not autonomous, and that there are, objectively speaking, things that we're obligated to do. But I think, Jacob, that one of the answers that I would give you, I'm reminded of something that the late Mario Cuomo said, which I've thought of many times over the past few years, where he said that you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. And that, the political personality needs to be able to master both of those. Mm. And I think Heschel himself talks about the fact that, the prophets can speak in the most elegant and eloquent language, but in our day-to-day lives, That's not the domain in which we live. And we need to have both the poetry and the prose in our lives in order to make them livable. Because if you don't have poetry, the prose can be incredibly destructive. But if you don't have the prose, the poetry just will make you a Luftmensch and you'll just float away. So it's a dialectic that's unresolvable, really, I think.
It's beautiful. I really appreciate it. And actually, Heschel himself writes what looks like prose, but it really is poetry. And so it's a beautiful space in which to bring him into this conversation. So thank you very much, Rabbi Skolnik, for being my teacher and mentor. And I know those in your community who are on today, thank you for being their mentor and teacher and friend for so many years. Just really thank you for preparing such a beautiful and very personal meditation on Revelation and Torah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.